So it's, what is OpenSolaris? It's a binary product. Okay, the actual branding, we call this thing OpenSolaris. Okay, but it also has a development project and a couple of websites. So it's already getting a little confusing now because this is some microsystems here. We have a .org website, which is primarily for development, and .com website, which is primarily for users. It's also, as I describe OpenSolaris, it's a community as well, and it's a global community. And there's other sites around the world, but it's multiple things. And this branding issue is very real for a company. How you actually brand something because it's tied to products. Just a quick program overview. We started in 2005, but as you'll see in the next slide, that is not when we actually started. It's when we started the start. We did it for one reason, which is to build a community. Okay. We sat around 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and we said, you know what, we've been selling Solaris to a user base, to an administrator base around the world, customers essentially, and partners. But in reality, Solaris grew from the open source community years and years ago, from BSD. We got away from those roots. OpenSolaris is the return to the open source community. That was the intention. The intention was to build a community. Okay? We had already employed all of our kernel developers. We were not looking necessarily for more kernel people. They're fairly rare in the world. We need more application developers, more users, more driver developers, things that we were not necessarily expertise in. And the strategy for doing this essentially is open development. And how I term that is you're opening source code, infrastructure, and conversations, things like that, across the firewall. Okay? As I said before, most of the developers are inside the company. And so how you build a community from that perspective is you got to open everything first. And as you'll see here, I think it's the next slide. Yeah, this is the opening sequence. And we're not finished necessarily down here. We started in 2003 with conversations. Many people think that, actually many people weren't sure who was behind the opening of Solaris. And it was the Solaris engineers themselves. Some people felt that this was forced on Sun or forced on Solaris engineers. It's not true. Solaris engineers had been arguing this for years inside the company. And they finally won the argument, and we started to open the code in actually 2005. We did a pilot program and a whole bunch of programs around. We had to get the code ready. We're talking about a significant amount of code, and we didn't own all of it. So it took years to actually do. We announced it in China, actually, and then we started releasing things in a sequence. When we first announced that we were going to open Solaris, nobody believed us. They said, no, you're not going to do it, you're lying. They said, you, son, are lying, you're not going to do it. Or, you're not going to release Solaris 10, you're going to release Solaris 9 and keep all the good stuff. So what we did here in January of 2005 is release dtrace, which was one of the core features of Solaris 10 at the time, and we released it first. We couldn't really do anything with it at the time because it was just one feature of the system. But we said, here it is. Here is our top technology. We're actually telling you the truth. We're going to actually do it this time. And the truth is, we weren't ready to release the whole thing here anyway, so we needed a few more months. And then a few months later, we released the kernel, which is about 10 million lines of code. And then, since then, we've had 50 or 60 more releases. So it came together in pieces. And this is important because in the early years, it was really hard to get involved. Very hard. You had to be a kernel engineer. You had to be super smart. And even then, it was hard. Very, very. People like me forget it. You could do nothing but watch. And it was painfully slow. So now down here, in 2008, 5 of 2008, we released the first version of this. Okay, so this is only 1 year old. Right? Many, many years had to deground what had to happen before this. And now that we have this, things are starting to move faster. Okay, so as I said, I'm basically a community guy, a community organizer. I'll talk a little bit about how I view engineering communities, or really any kind of community. And to me, these things are personal. Community organizing is basically what I am. This is personal. It involves lots of technology and code and infrastructure and things like that. But it's all about people. And I've learned this firsthand working with the Solaris engineering team, actually engineering organization, which is well over 1,000 people around the world in 22 sites. And so another thing I've learned is it's all based on trust. Okay? Even in a closed environment, the engineers still have relationships based on trust. You don't necessarily have to be open source in order to have a culture like that. And that existed in the Solaris organization even before we opened it. And that's my perspective. It really is very, very simple. How this actually manifests itself are actually in events like this. I take a lot of pictures. I have my camera here, and I am the #1 OpenSolaris photographer in the world. I've taken 10,000 photographs of OpenSolaris people. I did it for one reason. Everyone said there is no OpenSolaris community. So fine, I decided to photograph them. And I have 10,000 of these. No one's even close, by the way. And actually in Tokyo, I am known as the Linux photographer as well, because I hang out with the Linux community in Tokyo. I've taken hundreds of images of those guys. It's just fun. But this is a user group event we did in California just a few months ago. There's at least a dozen nations represented here. Okay? None of these people existed a few years ago. The second thing that's important is these are user groups. Okay? These guys grew out of nowhere. I mean, the vast majority of the people involved in OpenSolaris are kernel engineers, right? But these guys grew with very little support. It's active support, from Sun. We didn't have active programs because, frankly, we were too busy focusing on opening code and infrastructure and screwing some things up and things like that. While we were actually releasing all this stuff, these guys came to the tune of thousands. There's about 150 user groups now around the world. I would say about 100 of them are active. Some of them are very small, a handful of people, and some of them are very large, up to 500 to 600 people. And so it's just fun. And if actually these are the guys in Japan. This is one of the nice things about the Japanese one is they've grown very, very large, and they're starting to splinter off into subgroups. And this is one of the subgroups. This guy here, Ota-san, he's famous in China for his work on the EPC. He's famous because he blogs in English. A lot of the guys in Japan are only blogging and interacting in Japanese, but he's actually globally known at this point. These are some of the core guys. Actually, this is our VP here, Bill Franklin. These are some of the core engineers. I have a lot of these images, but my only point here is one of my jobs is to get folks like you to interact with people like that. I have all the confidence in the world that that the people here, or in Beijing, or in Tokyo, or wherever can build community locally. I can come visit and hang out, but really what I want to do is take you and connect you with the guys in other areas. This is where we've been very, very weak, very, very weak. We have, pockets of community around the world, but we have to connect them. So if you're interested in ZFS, this is Jack Barwick. He wrote ZFS. Okay. Now, how do I get an engineer in Taiwan to have an interaction with Jeff Barwick? Or with Stephen Hahn. This is Stephen Hahn here. Actually, he wrote the IPS, which is the image and packaging system on OpenSolaris.